Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Great to have you all here at Baltic this evening. This is a great and special occasion, I think. My name is Godfrey Worsdale and I'm Baltic's director, and I'm very pleased to introduce our panel for this evening's event. I won't start at either end. I'm going to start in the middle with Sara, the artist who's brought her artistic vision to this commission, and Peter Buchan, senior partner of Ryder Architecture, who has brought his architectural vision to this this project, but also a different kind of creativity that I'll come on to in a while. At the far end we have Chris Malcolm, architectural director for Ryder Architecture, who's from the Glasgow office collaborated very closely with Sara in the realisation of this collaboration. And at this end, Emma Dean, Baltic's curator, who has been the glue in the collaboration and has represented the institution to bring all the creative forces together. We've never done this before, and amongst other things, Peter plays a very important part at Baltic. He is our chairman of our board of trustees, my boss, and it's a very, very enjoyable and interesting experience to have someone leading you and inspiring you who comes from an architectural background. And one of the highlights of this experience is that as a person who's always worked in visual arts and a person who's always worked in the creative and design sphere of architecture, when we have what ought to be fairly bureaucratic, dull catch-up meetings every couple of weeks to talk about all the problems that we face in the world, one of the most wonderful things about meeting with Peter is one of the phrases that is very often repeated is, what would happen if, or how about we, and so many amazing ideas have been born out of those kind of conversations over coffee at 9 o'clock in the morning. And once upon a time, when we were talking about our exhibitions programme and the fact that there's this huge parallel and often overlapping creative forces of contemporary art and architecture, and so often the artists we work with, they don't have Sara's experience of this kind of collaborative approach, but of course artists always, when showing in spaces, are collaborating with and working around architecture. What if we made this more tangible? And so the idea of inviting the curatorial team at Baltic to kind of investigate artists who we felt would really respond well despite this collaborative idea by bringing them together with Peter and some of his creative team. What would happen? And immediately a sense of foreboding filled my mind, because architects by nature collaborate. Many of the artists I've worked with are by nature fairly lonesome characters, and they spend a lot of time on their own, and they spend a lot of time in the studio thinking things through and refining things. But actually, architects spend a lot of time on their own thinking things through and refining things, and artists negotiate with the world. So what I began to settle down in our conversations certainly encouraged this idea that we're only going to really get to the bottom of this if we get a group of architects and we get a great artist and we put them together and we see where we go. So we did. And you've all seen the results of that, which we're absolutely thrilled with, and we're delighted that this is the collaborative commission that you've all delivered for us that launches this collaborative approach, because we now have strong intentions that we will move forward finding an architect and an artist and marrying their creativity on a regular basis, because we think it's such a rich and exciting creative. And she'll lead us through this evening's discussion. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone. It was 7 months ago that we all sat in a room and thought about what this project could be. And it's been quite a journey for all of us, I think, learning about each other's work, how we approach making things, architecture, buildings, sculptures. And I wondered if perhaps to begin with we could talk about maybe your practice, maybe starting with Peter, Ryder architecture, and then maybe with Sara, talking about your work.
And then trying to understand where the common ground might have
and
come
common
from.
Ground, yeah.
Fine. Well, we're an architectural practice. We grew up in the northeast of England as a firm, so it's particularly nice for us that this is happening at Baltic, because this is our spiritual home. We celebrated our 60th anniversary last year, which for the quick-witted amongst you will work out that was 1953. And the practice was founded, that sort of period of post-war optimism was the essence of the beginnings of what is now Ryder in the northeast of England. It was Ryder and a firm called Ryder and Yates at the time, and the founding partners were committed modernists. I always thought it was incredibly brave of them to be sort of peddling really kind of hardline sort of modernist contemporary architecture in the northeast of England, but that's what they did. And they came directly from the stable of Corbusier in Paris, but more directly an interwar and sort of post-war architect called Berthold Lubetkin, who was his firm was called Tecton, and he was actually, I mean, he's relatively little known actually, but compared to someone like Corbusier, but his practice was actually probably it was undoubtedly at the forefront of that interwar, post-war modernism in Britain. Most of his work happens to be in London, but that's the way things are, I suppose, often. So the two founding partners kind of, met whilst working for Lubetkin and having worked for Corbusier. And that sort of principle, I suppose, there's a lovely legacy of those kind of post-war 1950s, 1960s buildings in the northeast of England, which is down to those guys. And that legacy has kind of stayed with me and with us. Less doctrinaire now, I would say, because that sort of post-war kind of international kind of spirit of modernism was very kind of a doctrinaire, stylistic approach as much as anything. But I think what's stayed with us is a commitment to buildings. We like our buildings to look nice, but it's very much about the way they work and the way they function and what they do for people. It's the impact that they have on people, which is probably the driver for us. But there's also the kind of the spirit of that modernist approach is also about stripping buildings back to their essence and actually designing around the sort of fundamentals of what a building should be and what structure should be and what place and space should be, and sort of understanding what impact that has on people, on humanity. So that's kind of where we came from. We now practice, as you sort of intimated before, our major base is still our original base here, but we practice out of Glasgow, we practice out of the northwest in Liverpool, we practice out of London, and we've got a sort of growing practice in Hong Kong, and doing everything from very sculptural renewable power stations on the Clyde that we were just talking about earlier to police headquarters in Kowloon. So it's kind of and everything in between. So it's now very broad based.
Yeah, and you've collaborated with kind of visual artists in the past.
Well, we've always collaborated. We've collaborated a lot with artists on building design. I suppose Newcastle, locally, Newcastle City Library is a case in point where we worked with artists in the development of the architecture and always wanted to get the artists involved as early in the process as we could. But we've never collaborated with art for art's sake before, so that's the difference. Yeah.
And I was remembering that painting was quite important in the beginnings of Peter's.
Peter Yates was it was Gordon Ryder and Peter Yates were the original partners. Peter Yates was a painter, something sort of passionately shared with Corbusier, and he and Corbusier shared sort of artworks in that sort of period during the 50s. Peter also produced. So this painterly approach was instrumental in underpinning design often, but he also produced murals that were incorporated into both Ryder and Yates's buildings and into Lebetkin's buildings often. So he would sort of collaborate. He would collaborate as the artist with other architects. So.
Kind of loosely having to connect with Sara there because
Sara that's fine. That's good. That's good. That's fine.
Because Sara, you studied history of art at Glasgow University first off, and then you studied painting at Glasgow School of Art.
Yeah.
So it's quite an interesting kind of path, really.
Yeah.
From theory to kind of more practical realisation of work.
So I graduated from Glasgow School of Art in 2003, and I've been there for 15 years, and I think it was it still is central to my practice that I graduated from a painting department, and I think the vocabulary that I've developed in my work through exploring the linearities of drawing and the surfaces of painting, but in a three-dimensional space, are what sort of typified the kind of the aesthetic of my work to date, and probably particularly in the last 5 years I've kind of really focused on those linear, elongated structures that we found so many kind of echoes with Ryder's architectural practice, and also expanded the surface of those painterly surfaces as well. Just to give a little kind of background to my influence, I don't know if it'll be as comprehensive as Peter's. That
hasn't been
good.
60 years, has
very
it?
Good.
You haven't got as much, that's the only difference.
My influences are quite broad, I suppose, in literature and architecture and painting, but all probably stemming off from this kind of central core, which is modernist and sometimes minimalist, but with kind of the softened edges of those people that kind of dealt with minimalism after that hard-edged minimalist Sol-LeWitt period in art. I think possibly what feels quite abstract to talk about here, but what's probably quite important for me to talk about is those modernist writers, the literary starting points for me. People like May Sarton, Virginia Woolf, Doris Lessing, a lot of female writers that dealt with boundaries, peripheries, these kind of physical linear structures that I've dealt with, but also a metaphorical notion of a boundary as well. Jeanette Winterson writes really well about these kind of thresholds that hold this sort of ceremonial quality in the history of our myth. This idea of transgressing a boundary in terms of the outline of a space, the boundaries of a space, in changing our assumptions of something, that shift can then be paradigmatic and can shake up the way we feel about everything. So those sort of physical thresholds have been something that I've kind of always explored in my work, and have been rooted from this this literary starting point. I do feel though that when I work, process is really key to the way I start making. So I'm almost witnessing a kind of materialisation of these ideas and influences at some point in the process. Maybe at the beginning, middle or end, I'll finally become aware of an influence that's sort of seeped into the work, and at that point it's about kind of a recognition of that influence and about kind of going with that, and it's at that point that the work emerges out of these familiar frameworks that I've set up within my practice, from which I can extend out of and explore ideas out of. It's that sort of repetition, that familiarity that I need in my kind of day-to-day working in order to reach out to that and go somewhere new with the work. So this idea of the room, of the biographical nature of space, as much as the architecture of space, have kind of always been hand in hand in my work. So it felt like, to work with Ryder was quite, was very natural, really, I think, for both of us, because we could, there's already these modernist, minimalist starting points, and this kind of ambition as well for me to work on a bigger scale, to expand what would normally be smaller, painterly starting points that are very much collaged together. There's a lot of freedom in the making, there's a lot of painting and exploring through process, and to have to actually be more systematic and decisive in the decision making felt like a really nice kind of opportunity to do that. Perhaps other aspects of my work that I could...
Just thinking, your process is very interesting, how you work with these kind of large expanses of aluminium and metal, and you kind of strip them back. Well, you paint first on the surface, then you strip them back, and then kind of manipulate them into these kind of forms. I think so. It does start from a kind of painterly place. I mean, that's it's coming out of that.
Definitely. So my process in the studio in the last few years has been to work on big expanses of aluminium and then cut away almost to reveal these slender shards of material that are capable then of holding, I feel, some of that influence, some of that reference and association, but with an economy that also kind of resonates with the way Ryder thinks and operates in its building, that kind of economy, sort of just enough of the reference, just enough meaning to allow the work still to be open. But by working on these bigger expanses of surface, that really allows for a kind of real freedom of movement and a gesture and a picture making, where that can all kind of come out, and then the decision making can happen at various stages. So by then just presenting these small parts of material, you're able to then be kind of and also working into the material again when it becomes three-dimensional and operating in space, you're able to really kind of deal with the optical possibilities of colour, those things that painting offers that sculpture quite often doesn't deal with, that maybe can deal with the negative space, the things around the work, but to be able to allow that associative reference, that sense of taste or decoration or surface detail, to be able to kind of to cling to that more barren scaffold of a sculpture, feels like that kind of duality is what is where I feel that's the excitement of making the work for me. Often the painting comes first, usually, so that will almost lead the three-dimensional form, just because the paint will offer up a certain direction, a certain sort of weight or dynamic possibility, just the way it's kind of leading the eye, which is interesting to me. And then that kind of loose collaging process builds up and can start to sort of activate the space, and at that point I have to kind of commit to it and deal with gravity and add a backing to it and sides to it and make it stronger and more robust, a kind of more of a backwards process of building up that way. Because with this project it couldn't really happen so much that way. I mean, in the maquette we could work that way quite freely, dealing with colour and lines and playing with the way things came together. But ultimately, working on the scale, there had to be quite a kind of decisive moment in the work where we sort of decided, this is the form of the thing.
He's got to do it.
This is the form, and this kind of associative reference, this sensibility would have to almost cling to that surface. So it would be, it would somehow work the other way around in that sense.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? That for you it starts with the surface, and for us it starts with the space. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where I've never actually thought that through before, but and it was the things that you were sort of saying earlier about the literary influences and the otherworldliness of about defining space in a slightly sort of ethereal sort of way, and about how you can actually look at space in a way that kind of leads you into another place, mentally as well as as physically. And I think those are the things that I initially got excited about. I think that's why, I suppose, scaling up the kinds of things that you were starting to play with, scaling that up to the point where you could actually occupy and make space out of the piece was the thing that I found really kind of exciting.
Yeah, because they're quite human-sized, aren't they, the sculptures really? They relate very much to the body. And with Jupiter Artlands, which was commissioned by the Edinburgh Festival, you really did start scaling up and using different materials, more industrial materials, more robust materials outside. And the team at Ryder went to visit that sculpture. Maybe Chris, were you there that day? Did you go to visit?
I wasn't there.
That's really Were you there, Peter?
I was there, yeah.
Peter.
No.
Okay. So, I think that was kind of, not a revelation, but it was a shift in what you could maybe perceive as possible.
Well, I think it was a sort of stage, it was a sort of step in a journey for you. I mean, I think this is where you can't really define how a sort of meeting of minds kind of happens, can you? I mean, as Godfrey said at the beginning, as architects, we're instinctively collaborative people. I mean, making a building is a collaborative process. Artists aren't, and I think you were. There was with some trepidation, I think, that you first engaged with us, in fairness, and you spent time in the studios and you spent time kind of understanding what we were about. But it was harder for you, I think, to make that kind of step. But I think it was just that incredibly logical step towards creating something that became a piece that you could actually experience by walking in and around and through, and all of the interesting things that were happening with glass and the reflections, that all of that stuff, that otherworldliness that comes from reflections that our brains often kind of cut out, because we kind of edit those out, don't we? Because we think of real things rather than kind of.
I think it was that point of Jupiter that when we were looking at the glass and the relationship the glass had, that kind of contingency.
And then just to be able to make a space out of it, I think was. And experience it in a very different way, I think, was a kind of, as a logical extension. I think it was a logical extension of kind of where you were going, but we probably just approached it from
I think the collaboration probably helped accelerate that in some ways. I mean, the process of working together with Sarah was very natural and very easy, and I think a large part of that was to do with we looked at the work in a phase that I suppose with kind of an architectural, from an architectural viewpoint, and there are very, very strong similarities in some of the things which we, not just as Ryder but as architects, are interested in. The materiality is of key importance in what you do. There's a really strong hierarchy within the materials. The glass has a certain role that it carries out that's not normally what you would associate with it, because it is structural. It is the bones. It is in many ways the ordered part of the object, and the lighter the metalwork becomes quite free-form and quite expressive on top of that. And even within the metalwork there's a hierarchy, because you have the painted elements, which are the kind of the main pieces that you see that are connected by this web of other elements. And I think that sense of exploring the potential of what materials can do is something that, you know, as architects we respond to, because I mean architecture is in a kind of funny position at the moment, because the essence of materials and how a material such as concrete or stone or glass dictates the way a building is designed. It always, what, you know, a masonry building traditionally had openings of a certain size, it looked a certain way, but the way construction technology is going now is starting to divorce us from some of those certainties. We're in the era of the lightweight frame, which is stone, wafer thin, you can do all these kind of things with it. And that kind of pulls the rug from under your feet a wee bit. So it's quite nice in this project to actually look at something that was about, well, these are materials, they are what they are, they're genuine in what they're doing. And I think it was, from your point of view, I think we felt that we had to understand what you were doing to give you enough space to develop along the way you want, but kind of try and encourage things to go down certain avenues. I mean, one of the things I thought was really interesting that you mentioned earlier about this idea of threshold in literature. Some of the slides that you've seen in the background are of the Italian architect Carlo Scarpa's work at Olivetti and various other things. And for guys like Scarpa and Carl Josef Schanner, the first step was the most important detail. How a step meets the ground, because that's the embarkation point on a journey. And I think it's interesting to see that influence coming out and how we dealt with the ground next door. You know, because it's definitely part of that same language that's coming through.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that, isn't it? That all of those things are working together to do that same thing. And actually, in our conversations, one of the main things that we talked about, sort of at one of those moments in the maquette making, was pulling the parts of the sculpture apart so that you had that passage through the work. And Peter had said that point that we make all the time, which is the work should be as much of the space as in the space. And that was, you know, really key to it, kind of connecting with the architecture and us participating in the work, that or, you know, that the work almost became architectural, that those elements of glass and brass and aluminium and paint that had been such familiar in our practice almost took on a really, like a new role, kind of completely.
I didn't want a plinth, did I? I didn't want a plinth at all. I wanted it just to be. I'm pleased. I'm pleased. I'm pleased it had one in it. But what I think was nice in the end was the deconstructed plinth. So it sort of it kind of cascades off the plinth and becomes of the space, which I thought was kind of nice. It sort of inverts the whole plinth art on a plinth thing, which is good. I think
it does, which is always.
I like that.
It's kind of difficult to do these days in art, or I suppose, you know, the way Scarpa would have thought of those things as almost art objects in themselves as well as architecture, like that kind of, although the kind of the function's key, the way those floating steps are sort of suspended.
Everything has another meaning, or you know, the way you think something. You know, the classic Scarpa is to have a beam over an arch. It's split in the middle, so it can't possibly be holding up what you think it's holding up. But no, it's. I mean, I thought it was quite interesting, even coming in. You know, I've not seen the work for a couple of months. Coming into the gallery today, you know, the sense of direction that the thing's got sitting within the space is really good. You know, I think the scale of it. You know, if you think, you know, it is that progression from the work on the wall, the freestanding bits in the gallery. You know, Jupiter, and then this occupying what's a significant scale of space, and it sits comfortably. You know, it's comfortable within. It's got a really strong sense of direction. I mean, it reminded me of, you know, a Chernikov drawing when you kind of, you know, Russian constructive stuff. Just really,
because that was one of the biggest challenges in a way, wasn't it? When sort of dealing with the height of that room.
Well, the room didn't exist either when we were designing it.
Completely remodelled, so redesigned, should I say?
So I suppose it was kind of bespoke, but at the same time it had its parameters.
Yes, it did.
And you know, that was great. We wanted to kind of fill that space, but we also had our limitations in terms of what we could spend, although, you know, we weren't really, you know, looking back on it now and working on new projects and things, I realised that we weren't really very limited, you know. We had, you know, I'm really lucky we were.
It was still a stretch, dear, wasn't it? It was a bit of a stretch.
But there were lots of conversations on how we could reduce the pieces of glass or the metalwork, or if the glass was the more expensive element, how much of that would we need to complicate the view to reflect and refract those metal parts? Could it be that the metalwork was the part that extended into the ceiling? And so you know, some of those kind of practical considerations then led the final form, which is a nice way of working, I think, and it's not something that I am not massively practical, you know, in that sense. It's not always.
So you're going to go back to nice little simple wall hung
not necessarily
pieces now.
small, but just probably impossible, possibly.
Possible, yeah.
But you know, that part of the process was interesting because, you know, what Godfrey was saying earlier, you know, I think as architects, because it is such a collaborative process, and it's the dialogue you have with clients, contractors, other consultants, you know, suppliers, all these things that, you know, goes into putting a building together. And I think we sometimes have this idea that the grass is always greener for the artist who sits in purely creative isolation. And it was a bit of an eye-opener working with you, realising, well, actually, the same pressures exist.
It wasn't as straightforward as we hoped it was going to be.
You know, it's there are the budget issues which in some ways do help to try and distill a thing down to its essence. You know, you could always do more, you can always have more to spend on things and do things that you would like to, but it did reduce the things down to the fundamental pieces, and I don't think that's been at all to its detriment. You know, but I think it's given us, or certainly me, a kind of a healthy respect for just how much stuff, you know, many steps there are in that process to actually deliver something, you know, of any kind of scale.
Let's go.
So,
I know it's quite amazing thinking it was 7 months ago actually when you said that. I kind of had added a few more in my head.
Yeah, since we actually started the process and had the first conversations.
Yeah.
I mean, they're really, the whole thing, I guess it's a series of exchanges between you really, and meetings, and kind of discussed how the form would develop. And it might be useful to talk about the kind of process of the maquette, well, the drawings first and then the maquette, and how you negotiated that and talked about that together, and how it would translate really into a real kind of object in the gallery.
Well, we talked a lot first, didn't we?
Yeah.
We talked a lot first.
Yeah, I think it
And
was getting
thought
to know
about-
each
thought
other's
about-
practices
yeah.
and each other. You know, because, well, for me, like Peter said, I was anxious going into the process just because of that amount of control I normally have over the piece, and that's not to say that I didn't want to collaborate, but it's just that because I know that sort of witnessing that I talked about, those changes in the work can happen at so many points in the process, and to sort of let that go and let the other voices come in. And I did, you know, unless you can really trust in the people you're collaborating with, that's almost impossible because the sort of doubt starts to filter in, and so it was really kind of getting to know Ryder and understanding then that we did have this sympathy with where we were both coming from, you know, in terms of aesthetics and a kind of feeling about the way even detail and fixings would happen. That there was, I was not really aware of Ryder's practice, although I was aware of Ryder's buildings. So, you know, I had a pretty quite simplistic idea of long lines and simple, elegant minimalism, really, glass and metalwork. So we already kind of had that coming together. But I thought because it was architecture, and you know, some of these literary starting points that I talk about, these women were talking about confines to be transcended. We're talking about this idea of the room as a barrier, as a boundary, and those confines were traditionally, you know, built by men, and it was that kind of real robust, practical nature of architecture that I feel like I've always sort of softened the edges of, and always tried to be more kind of playful with the materials. And so I think that was one of my fears, that if we couldn't have a kind of sympathetic approach to the material, everything would become so robust and strong that it would lose that sort of vulnerability that I feel is important in sculpture, that allows it to have this kind of physical reverberation with you, with the viewer, and so that kind of top heaviness, or that slight sense of
There's a certain
impossibility.
precariousness to everything.
Yeah.
It's on the edge of.
Yeah.
But
'Cause
I
it-
think that's part of the charm.
Yeah, the earlier works you were using kind of jewellery making techniques, and you're quite interested in handmade and craft based techniques, and so taking that from something quite delicate and then becoming something much more robust, and using brass and copper and all these other materials. It's quite a leap of faith, really, in some ways.
And on a scale of sort of plumbing, really, or those were the kind of dimensions that I was encouraged to scale up to.
But everything
those
was
2 dimensions
perfectly,
of pipe work, basically.
Yeah. Everything's perfectly placed. There were all the rivets and bolts completely symmetrical. I remember we walked
we
around
did
and
have a good
everything was
tour.
perfect. And every element needs to be there. So, but I wonder about the choice of those materials and how you kind of discuss that, and especially the treatment of the plinths and this kind of cement render on the wood. That's an amazing tactile surface. We've had lots of people coming in and standing on it by mistake, lots of little kids coming in, but it is, you want to touch it, you want to kind of make contact with it.
There's a sort of sense of solidity, which is a nice kind of counterpoint to the sort of delicate ephemerality of the rest of the piece. But then you realise it can't be solid. It's not, because it's floating and it's kind of doing all of this.
I think there were no budget limitations. We would have had large slabs of travertine.
Marble or something.
That was pushing it a wee bit.
Yeah, because it really came out of the conversations about Scarpa and these sort of impossibility of those floating slabs.
Planes.
But actually the process of the kind of the pouring of the render feels sort of equally fitting. There's that kind of sense of sort of slippage and a kind of painterly surface. So I don't think there's any sense of sort of shattering the illusion that it's not solid. It's just that ambiguity that runs through all of the materials, I think.
I think the other part of this is that with working at this scale, is that suddenly you're relying on the on the assembly and manufacturing expertise of other people, which we're absolutely used to. As an artist, you're not necessarily. So the people involved in the fabrication of all of that. And
so
your technicians here at Baltic, who kind of helping us kind of work out how to do those plinths, for instance. It was absolutely crucial without those people.
It was really important to have that kind of trust with them, and sort of every step of that process of fabricating the metal parts, we were able to go into the workshop and deal with a certain way a fixing would come about, because initially some of those fixings were really overly complicated. That the first way you'd imagine to fix a brass part to then an aluminium part of a different scale to a wooden section, because the aluminium has a kind of wooden core. So there were all these different materials that came together in some quite complicated looking joints that needed to be kind of worked through and simplified, and all of those moments, even to the point where there were lots of conversations about should we suspend a part of the metalwork, which none of us particularly wanted to do. And so then we were aware that those really long lengths of metal might potentially bow and sag in the space, and so that was something that just had to wait for the install. We had to just see if they did bow and sag,
let it happen,
and kind of let it happen. And one of them sort of in midweek was kind of bowing over quite far, and we were able to sort of pull that back by adjusting another line, so that it then became dependent on another part of the sculpture. So not by suspending it or even straightening it without then unstraightening another part, So it's still had this kind of lightness about it. Even
And we would think
in
of that
spite
as a sort of
scale.
structural equilibrium that's it's impossible to calculate, but it's there because there is that sort of harmony between the way those different
exactly. So you'll
materials-
notice on the sort of what feels like a sort of mast of this, sail or something, that really tall part of the sculpture that kind of leans. There's a sort of a kind of sense of leaning in that, which I quite like. I think there's a more kind of physical presence through that.
I think it's also, you don't want something that is so precisely controlled that it becomes static. It needs to have that element of implied motion within it, and I think it does that, really pretty successfully. But, I think one of the most enjoyable aspects I found was those moments working with the guys, Ian from here and Scott Associates and yourselves. How do we do this? How do we, it's one of the most enjoyable aspects of a building, when you're sitting around with a team saying, right, how do we transform what has been a drawing into built reality? When you're doing it with something like this, a purely creative endeavour, it kind of ups the scale of the challenges, because there's no plasterboard, there's no finishes to hide something that is what it is. I thought that was really...
There were many prototypes.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it was the prototype. It is the prototype.
Even the use of maquettes, I think that was, for us, that was a really good moment in terms of the language and the way that you were approaching it, where you felt, this is the right direction, it's the right type of approach. And for us, from that point on, I think it was maybe trying to show you other sources of inspiration, things, but just trying to encourage you to keep sort of doing more of what you were doing, and then perhaps filtering the installation within the actual constraints of the space.
But working with maquettes and models is something that we do a lot, and that was something that we had in
the beginning,
because you
there's some
provided
images behind of the maquette in the space.
Exactly, you can see it's quite a bit more makeshift than a Ryder maquette might normally be.
Some sellotape involved, a bit of cardboard.
Oh, that's lovely.
Because I was provided with the kind of scale model of the new bespoke space, which was quite uniform and precise, and there was just no way that I could get my head into making a maquette that would neatly fit into that space. So I just had to kind of remeasure a crusty, rustic piece of board to then to work in a way that felt more natural to me, which was to stick other bits of wood on and to build up from there.
I do remember one of the kind of early sessions that we had in your studio, when I thought the relationship was absolutely over, because Sarah had this maquette that was like, it was sort of balanced on sort of like three different sort of tables with bricks and bits of wood and things, and one of our guys stood up with a cup of tea and kicked a table accidentally, and the whole thing just went, it just flat packed, didn't it, instantly? You were very stoic about that, actually.
It's happened so many times before.
We
It'll
have
be
the
fine,
image
it'll be
before
fine.
it fell on the slide.
Is it on there?
It was captured by an
brilliant.
iPhone.
Oh, God, yeah.
That's the next one that we'll do. Yeah.
I think the point you made there about when you looked at the first maquette and you thought, I can't do this, making this thing fit neatly in the space.
Yeah.
I think that's another aspect, and it might have been the next stage that we would have looked to take the thing through, is that idea. We always kind of talked about this thing as being the gallery becoming a convergence point of sort of some wider event. This is where the metalwork and the floor, where the plinths meet, with the glass being the thing that's in tension between them. And I think it's important that there's a sense that the thing goes on, it carries beyond the confines and the limits of the gallery or the space that you're in, even if it's just very subtly implied. And I think it does that more through the sense of direction, but with more material, I don't know, more scope
More money.
to just get stuck into the gallery,
It's talked about since it's over. Yeah.
It'd be interesting just as expand the thing, take a slice through the skin of the building, just keep going.
Yeah.
Godfrey.
I think it's quite nice
Panicking,
when you don't
he's
see
left
an
the room, I
end.
think.
Yeah. I think it's quite nice when you don't see an end to a project that way. I feel like that's something that I sort of desire for every singular piece of work that I make, that there's this slight potentiality, you know, in the way that drawing is kind of provisional and repetitive, and a real direct, honest relationship with people who made it. It's sort of, it's infinitely possible. And that's what felt like was kind of happening with our work. It felt like we could kind of keep shifting it, and even as you're moving around it, you're getting some sense of those different possibilities. You're seeing it in different ways, so it can't really be kind of captured in a single image. It's about that experience of it.
I have to say, I mean, I'm amazed at the photos that were on the website of it, because you know, they've actually come out really well.
Yeah,
I could never get a single good photograph of any of the
No,
maquettes
I
we
know.
were working on.
I
It
know.
just seemed to compress the.
It needs
the
to be
space
finished,
flat.
I think, by the white gallery. I think having those, you know, the way that the walls were built white to the top, and it has the black of the waterfront, the lift shaft, and the white, you know, it needs that kind of to complete it, because the maquette was fighting with all of us and everything in my studio, and kind
Clumsy architects.
Well, there was the big debate about whether or not the background should become black or
Yeah.
not. I mean, I think in retrospect that would have been far too
Yeah.
Very
imposing.
dramatic.
yeah.
It was the right decision.
Yeah, exactly. I think that came about, I mean, it was probably me who suggested it, but I think because of the title of the work, A Subtle Knife, and our conversations about science fiction. A Subtle Knife's the second in Pullman's trilogy, his Dark Materials, and this idea of infinite space and kind of and blackness and anti-colour and paint, and these things were quite exciting as ideas. I mean, they weren't, I think, didn't Scarpa, or I think it was actually Corbusier who wanted everything painted white. They said it would have been completely anti their kind of aesthetic, and it wouldn't have been so classically sculptural either, but it was something that we kind of toyed with as another three walls of blackness to echo the blackness of the lift shaft. But actually, I think we kind of, what we got in the end was the classical context of the white gallery space. From the other view, you also get the kind of the blackness and infinite quality of that lift shaft.
I think that's what it really
And
was.
changing light conditions, I
Yeah.
think, as well, which was important in terms of the reflections and
Yeah.
how work was perceived.
Yeah, but you get that sense as you look, you know, at that direction. It just, that's where it goes on,
Yeah.
and it can just reach out
Yeah.
for that space.
Yeah, yeah.
I think even though it wasn't intentional, there is quite a direct relationship with the building and the actual kind of grid structure of the glass lift shaft at the front.
Yeah.
And that was quite surprising to me, making those kind of nice connections as you walk around the work.
Yeah.
It kind of echoes somehow the kind of framework of the lift shaft. It's something really lovely about that connection. And
I was thinking a little bit about those small sections of grid that kind of operate like little motifs in the work, and there's only these two sort of fragments of grid in the whole sculpture, but they're just kind of indicating something beyond the sculpture, and they also take this three-dimensional form and sort of in parts flatten it again and bring it back to something that I think references something like a Solowit or an Agnes Martin, or that kind of grid of painting where you're kind of forced to be flattened, and then it also does refer to those polished metals of the lift shaft and the framework. Those kind of grids are echoed, but because of its slightness and the sense of movement through it, it's as much like a motif found in a Kandinsky painting or a scribble or something. There's a sort of lightness and fluidity about it, which wasn't really planned so much, but kind of really resonated with me because of this influence of cubist painting and the fragmenting of form, to be able to represent multiple views in one then singular thing. So it felt like that kind of it had that kind of flow through it, that sort of rhythmical thing that Kandinsky and Clay and Lionel Feininger and some of these painters I was really interested in would have used as these sorts of symbols, these motifs that you'd find in their paintings. It's something that kind of just happened. That was an architectural reference, but for me a sort of symbol of something else as well, and another layer of meaning that you can maybe find in the work.
You mentioned cubism there, and I remember we looked at a strip of painterly and the painted element, and you were talking about a painting that had influenced you. Maybe it was a British artist who'd
it was
proto-cubist painter.
It was Lionel Feininger, and his painting, I think it was 1929, he painted it sailboats, which it felt really fitting for loads of reasons, being on the waterfront and thinking of a subtle knife, which describes this knife that's capable of cutting through membranes that separate one world from another. And the knife is described as a sort of oily swirl of bruised purples and sea blues. This kind of really romantic, sort of hazy swathe of colour that I've described before when I talk about my kind of palette, sort of St Ivesy palette of kind of blues and soft pastel colours ultimately. And Lionel Feininger anyway paints these kind of prisms of light and triangular shapes that describe the water and sailboats and these kind of forms. And so although my choice for kind of colour and a palette never really always comes from a singular starting point, that was certainly an influence, and that idea of a kind of vessel or a boat was something that his peers, Kandinsky and Clay, would have seen as this kind of romantic, hopeful, sort of questing sort of image or symbol, which felt quite fitting for the piece as well.
I wonder if this is the point to kind of open up to questions from anyone. Any questions?
When the architect's building buildings, normally has to conform because the building has a function. With the artist, it seems to me that you have absorbed that to a certain effect, and your piece seems to have a function as well as being a pure piece of art. Have I took the right vibrations?
While she's thinking, give her time to think. The thing that really appealed to me was working on something that didn't have a function was quite liberating, and I think that was, in terms of, well, you describe a function in different ways, I suppose. I mean, for us, it was not having a client was actually quite interesting, so it was liberating for us, that simplicity of the expression. But it's the way you've expressed that is interesting.
I don't know that I see the piece as having a functionality per se, but I think the material elements can be read through their recognised or historic or assumed function more because of the scale and the relationship to the building. So I still feel like this is an autonomous thing, but I feel like those sort of those scaled up pipes of plumbing, or those huge glass slices now that become like these walls to more intimate spaces, lead us somewhere else to this other place which is functional. So I think it has a kind of really nice relationship to function, and it's quite an interesting question, but to me, I suppose, I think that it isn't architecture, and that it isn't a stairway, and that it's sort of skirting around all those things and becoming none of them.
In a positive way.
I think you could look at it and see that there are functional aspects in terms of the, the hierarchy of the forms within it. There's a function which the plinths serve in terms of they root and they support the glass, which in turn supports the structure above it. And as an object which animates the space through there, it functions well at doing that. The position of certain pieces force you to move in certain directions, which in turn then reinforces your desire for us to see it from different aspects. So I think it does it quite subtly. It's not functionalist to the extent of complying with a defined brief of, well, here's your toilets, your plant room, and all sorts. It's a lot better than that. But it does.
It's the freedom bit, isn't it?
But I think it's got its own order to it. And I think that for me makes it.
There is a functional order.
It's functionalist in its own way. And that, I guess, kind of goes back to the connections with, constructivism.
And minimalism, the kind of language of minimalism.
But it still maintains the precariousness, which is important to you. And to do it on that scale is quite extraordinary. And the tension between the space, which I thought was interesting, there is a tension between that room and Sara. Did you feel it when you were instructed as the architect? That there is a tension between...
In the space?
Yeah.
I think this is what was kind of interesting about making the space, because part of this was about sort of helping Baltic make a better use of that space out there, which has always been difficult to curate. And so that we kind of, the making of the space and the making of the piece happened together. And when I kept saying it's a piece of the space rather than in the space, that was kind of what I meant.
But it's challenging the space.
Absolutely. There is that dynamic between.
It's not a passive.
Absolutely.
Enclosed.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how you felt about that as the purveyor of the space, whether you liked that tension.
No, absolutely. I think that's for me what it was about, and the fact that you created these kind of routes into potentially other worlds, and there was this, that whole kind of ephemerality of you're dividing the space, but you're not dividing the space, and there's a reality of the physical objects in the space, but then there's the richness of the reflected objects, which kind of vary, depending on natural light conditions, which was also an important part of our discussions, which we haven't touched on. The fact that we deliberately left it open so that it was influenced by natural light and would change, at different points in the day.
And I think that tension is at the heart of it, because as you come into the gallery, the first thing you're presented with is the vertical edge. Whether it reads as the blade of a knife or the prow of a ship, the thing is, it's coming at you.
It's aggressive.
It's not. If it was coming over another meter, then maybe that would be aggressive. I'd say it's more. It's rising up. It's more aspirational than aggressive. But
get aggressive. That's
but there is definitely that sense of motion, dynamism.
Thank you.
Yes, Sara, you over the last few months you've got to know the Baltic building very well. Is there any other space in the building that you're dying to build that stop?
Here's an opportunity here. Is Godfrey still here?
That's a loaded question.
I haven't let myself dream that much, but all of the gallery spaces here are incredible, and it's amazing. Is it the fourth floor space that you can look down from the balcony?
Yeah.
That kind of huge space is just to be able to view the works.
Go for it.
From that point, that's the space I want to fill.
Are there any other spaces though that are not necessarily
gallery spaces?
Space? Yeah.
Well, that's
stairwell or something like that.
Yeah.
Partly, with both of his big residents of Glasgow, there's a fantastic old rotunda, which is the entry point to the Old Cliff Tunnel, which has now been sealed up, and it would be fantastic
to see the sculpture there,
to let it grow and let it, because the lines you've got can relate to different spaces, and just let it go in and see what it wants to do.
Sue's very, very specific though. She wanted to know about here.
This yeah, I know, exactly. Outside would be incredible, but also, you know, the great big stairwell. You know, there's that kind of just the idea of suspending something in that stairwell, because you've got that mirrored, impossible depth, which is amazing. Which I think confused all of us going down the stairwell. We almost kind of just went too far down the road. But yeah, I mean, it's been
The infinite staircase.
Yeah, the infinite staircase.
Anything outside would have to be extremely durable here.
Yeah, thick metal, thick glass.
And the Jupiter work was made out of it's concrete foundations and then base, and then these very strong materials again.
So although it was a smaller work than this piece, it was those kind of, it was marble chip concrete base, and the glass was, I mean, it's always toughened and, you know, reinforced and softened edges and all this. But although it looks kind of light, that glass is actually, you know, really thick. But the outdoors and the kind of, I think the background of the landscape really kind of softens those edges, and it does become more like architecture. So then to use glass any less than kind of an inch thick, somehow half an inch thick maybe, seems playful, seems kind of light, and feels more like sculpture. So it's, yeah, it's kind of, that was something that I was concerned about, I think, in moving the scale up again, but moving inside. So this is, you know, by far the biggest piece I could, you know, comprehend inside. And I was really worried that it would lose that lightness, because it wouldn't be in this infinite space, which was Jupiter Artland. It would be in the confines of the gallery. So that was something that, you know, I felt we had to tread a really fine line with. I was really pleased when Karen came in and said that to me, that she felt like it had that kind of precariousness and that tension, and it still had that fragility that she'd felt that off it. Was really nice.
Right.
Would you just, I think it's a question for all three, consider collaborating on a building or pavilion of that kind, rather than maybe as an artwork in a gallery?
Would you invite me to do that?
I think that's a great idea. I think once you find that you know you can. Everything in life is about finding kindred spirits, isn't it? And finding people that you can sort of bounce ideas around with, and take you to a place that you wouldn't have gone to on your own, I suppose. And that's, you know, in architecture, that's what I enjoy the most, and I guess it's what I've got most out of collaborating with artists in the past, because of bringing just you're working to one end, but with people coming from a totally different point of view. And that can be disastrous, or it can be very constructive, and it's a very interesting kind of question. I suppose we've never really thought beyond having got through this, have we? But you know, it would be lovely actually. And once you do find, you know, that you've got that sort of rapport and mutual understanding, it'd be quite interesting to kind of shift the emphasis, wouldn't it, to
I'd like to do that.
Architecture. I tell you what, if we can come through this and still want to do something else, that's pretty good, isn't it? Thank you for that question.
Any other questions? No? Okay, I don't know if, I think Godfrey's gone, maybe. I can't see him. Oh, Godfrey, sorry. I was just about to thank everyone, but maybe you want to...
yes, I would,
Tale.
and I was quite remiss at the start of the evening, because I forgot to say something that was very important. This is a bit of a first for Baltic, but as a result of working with This Is Tomorrow, this event's been live streamed. I was supposed to say that to you before, so you all grab your moment live in the World Wide Web, and sadly missed that one. But very important for us, and I think we're quite so full of call that probably will say that. So thank you for your work, for capturing this evening, and I'm sure it will now be out there worldwide open to find. Thank you, Emma. Peter, Sara, Chris, fantastic conversation, fantastic project. You've given this architecture artist commission a fantastic start. I can't wait now to see where this takes Baltic and our partnership with Ryder and where it takes us in the future. So big thank you to our panel.